Her phone rang 11 seconds later. His voice was low and careful. The voice of someone who had been practicing care for a long time, who had learned through Sienna, she thought, through the 9 years before the ring and the 3 after, that careful was not the same as gentle. That careful was actually something more demanding than gentle, requiring you to attend to the exact weight of each word before you place it down. He said, "Hello, Vesper," and she said, "Hello, Calder," and outside the window, the rain fell over Chicago in long silver curtains, and the city below was all amber street light and dark water. And somewhere across that city, in an apartment whose address she did not know, a man sat in the passenger seat of a car he no longer drove, talking to a woman who was wearing a dead man's coat. And neither of them knew yet what was already in motion. Neither of them knew what the rain remembered. The transition from ink to breath is a violent thing. For 4 months, Vesper Malone had lived within the critical, sterile parameters of the Forum, a digital purgatory where grief was flattened into pixels, safely contained by the glass of a laptop screen. The words had been clean. They did not possess faces that demanded interpretation. They did not have throats that caught on a hard vowel or lungs that required air. In the small hours of the Chicago night, sitting on the cold tiles of her bathroom floor, because the bedroom felt like an exhibit she was not licensed to curate, she had woven a phantom out of text. His name was Calder. He was an arrangement of serifs and line breaks. He was an echo that answered her own. But when the telephone line finally severed the safety of their anonymity, it did not feel like a bridge. It felt like a tripwire. The phone had rung exactly 11 seconds after she typed her consent. When she lifted the receiver to her ear, the silence that preceded his speech was not the empty space between notifications. It was a physical vacuum, a sudden drop in barometric pressure that made the skin behind her ears tighten. Then came his voice. It was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of the polished literary comfort she had spent weeks attributing to him. It had a dense, scraping quality that sounded exactly like the Chicago winter outside her window. The sound of road salt under a tire, of frozen slush shifting against a curb. It was an unedited voice. More than that, it carried a distinct acoustic property, the hollow reverberating cold of an empty room. It was the voice of a man who lived in a house where the rugs had been pulled up. We have to stop looking at the glass, he had said on their third night of calls. He did not say hello anymore. They did not trade the conventional social currency of people getting to know one another. They simply picked up the conversation like long-term blockades that had been interrupted by a brief, insignificant noise. The rain isn't a language, Vesper. It's just water trying to find the lowest possible point. And I think we're the lowest point. That sounds like a warning, she had whispered. She was standing at her kitchen counter, her thumb rhythmically tracing the frayed, oil-stained cuff of Luca's grey wool coat. She hadn't taken it off. in 22 days. The wool was beginning to smell like her soap, her toast, her sweat, which meant it was beginning to smell less like him. The realization was a slow, daily leak in her chest. It is. Calder's voice had rasped through the small speaker, close enough to vibrate against her jawbone. I am warning you about myself. Or maybe I'm warning myself about the way you look at a museum. People only visit museums to look at things that have already been conquered. They want to see the dull swords behind the glass. They want to feel safe because the war is over. And is our war over? No, he said, and the word had the heavy, flat thud of a sandbag dropping into the mud. The ledger is still open. We're just the accountants who survived the fire. The line had clicked shut before she could ask him what he meant by the ledger. He had a habit of hanging up without a cadence of departure, leaving her with a dead dial tone that sounded like a flat line. The invitation, when it arrived 3 days later via a stark, single-line text message at 2 in the morning, was not an invitation at all. It was an appointment for a collision. Saturday, 2 o'clock, the Art Institute, the room with the small, terrible things. She had stared at the screen until her eyes burned, the blue light reflecting off the dark bathroom walls. The small, terrible things. She knew exactly what he meant. He was talking about the Thorn miniature rooms in the basement of the museum. Those 68 shadow boxes of perfect dead history. A sanctuary of total control. She hadn't replied, but Her hands had already begun the silent calculation of what she would wear to meet the man whose wife had died in the same square yard of asphalt where her husband had lost his life. The realization did not arrive gently. It hit her with the sharp, sickening force of a physical blow to the sternum at noon on Saturday. Vesper stood before the bathroom mirror. The small bulb overhead, casting a yellow, unforgiving glare over her features, and for the first time in 5 months, she did not look at her grief. She looked at her face. More specifically, she looked at her skin, at the slight hollows beneath her cheekbones, and she felt a sudden, hot surge of an impulse she thought had died in the corridor of Rush University Medical Center. She wanted to look beautiful for him. It was an aggressive, predatory sort of desire, completely detached from the soft, poetic mourning she had curated on the forum. It was a pulse that felt illicit, a sudden contradiction of the muscles that had nothing to do with the heavy, unmoving weight of her widowhood. To want to be witnessed by a stranger when the only eyes that had ever truly mattered were rotting 6 feet beneath the frozen Illinois topsoil was a specific brand of treason. It was an admission that the body was still functional, that the blood was still stupidly, stubbornly pumping through valves that should have closed out of solidarity with Luca's stopped heart. Her fingers trembled as they reached for the drawer beneath the sink. Her hand hovered over a small, square tube of lipstick she hadn't touched since the previous autumn. A dense, matte shade called Venetian earth. It was a dark, bruised terracotta, a color that Luca had always said made her look like a painting he couldn't afford to buy. He used to kiss her when she wore it, just to see if the pigment would transfer to his lower lip, laughing when he walked into his office with a faint reddish stain like a brand. She uncapped the tube, the scent of it, wax, vanilla, and something metallic, hit her throat like an old habit. She painted her lips with a precision that felt like a desecration, her hand steadying only when the red outline was sharp enough to look like an incision. The thought returned to want to be witnessed by a stranger when the only eyes that mattered were rotting 6 feet beneath the Illinois topsoil was a specific brand of treason. She turned her body before the glass, watching the way a dark, heavy silk blouse draped over her collarbones. She had lost weight since November. The silk sat loose, emphasizing the sharp, defensive ridge of her shoulders. She noted with a flush of hot, defensive shame that her waist looked small beneath the fabric, that her hair had a clean, heavy luster to it because she had washed it twice that morning. She was dressing for a hunt. She was dressing to survive a man who had survived her husband's death, and the knowledge of her own vanity made her stomach turn with a sour, oily guilt. When she finally pulled Luca's grey wool coat over her shoulders, the experience was entirely different than it had been for the last 3 weeks. The fabric did not feel like a sanctuary anymore. It did not feel like the warm, lingering arm of her husband across her back. It felt like a shroud she was forcing a corpse to share with a living woman. The coat was too large, the shoulders dropping past her own, the hem hitting her mid-calf like an oversized uniform borrowed from a soldier who hadn't returned from the front. She looked at her reflection one last time. The painted lips, the sharp, hyper-focused eyes, the dead man's wool, and understood that her motives were not clean. She was not going to the Art Institute to heal. She was not going to exchange notes on the stages of recovery or hold the hand of a fellow traveler in the valley of the shadow. She was going to see if Calder Mourne's hands were as broken as her own, or if he possessed the keys to the exit she hadn't been able to find. She was going to look at the wreckage through his eyes to see if her own narrative was correct. The brain requires narrative, she reminded herself as she locked the apartment door behind her. But some narratives are written in blood, and those are the ones that don't allow for an editor's note. The Thorn miniature rooms live in the basement of the Art Institute, a subterranean vault where the light is kept low and the air is maintained at a constant, unmoving temperature to preserve the tiny illusions within the walls. It is a place of absolute, suffocating control. Behind the thick panes of glass, 68 shadow boxes present perfect, microscopic reconstructions of European and American interiors from the 16th century onward. There is no dust there. There are no drafts to disturb the tiny velvet curtains. No grease on the miniature silver teapots. No human breath to cloud the tiny mirrors hanging above 1-inch mantelpieces. It is a monument to the exclusion of life. Vesper walked through the dim gallery. The sound of her high-heeled boots clicking against the marble floor with a sudden, accelerated tempo that sounded like teeth chattering in the dark. The noise was too loud for the room. The handful of tourists present turned to look at her, their faces pale and soft in the ambient glow from the display cases. She ignored them, her eyes scanning the small, lit windows in the stone. She found him standing before E18, English drawing room of the Stuart period. She knew him instantly. It was not by his face, which she had never seen, and which was leaner, more angular than the soft-edged scholar she had imagined from his prose, but by his posture. Calder Mourne stood with his hands driven so deep into the pockets of a dark oilskin trench coat. The fabric was strained white across his thighs. His shoulders were curved inward, his neck slightly bent, as if he were trying to occupy less of the atmosphere than he had legally allotted by the state. He looked like a man who had spent months attempting to compress himself into a single point so that nothing else could hit him. He had dark hair that was beginning to go grey at the temples, cut short and messy, as if he had run his hands through it until it gave up trying to lie flat. His nose had been broken once. There was a slight, hard ridge near the bridge that turned his profile into something slightly hawkish, and his eyes, when he finally turned them toward her, were the exact color of cold tea left out overnight in an iron mug. She walked up beside him. She did not look at him. She looked into the shadow box, where a perfect, tiny walnut table sat beneath an invisible ceiling. They're too perfect, she said, her voice cutting through the gallery's dim silence like an ungreased hinge. There's no room for an argument in there. You couldn't leave a coffee mug on the table if you wanted to. The curator would come with tweezers and put it back in the cabinet. Calder didn't turn his head immediately. He kept his eyes fixed on a tiny, 1 inch high velvet chair inside the glass case, his jaw working behind the skin of his throat. When he finally looked at her, his gaze didn't linger on her eyes. It dropped straight to her mouth, to the sharp, aggressive red of the Venetian earth lipstick, and then travelled slowly, deliberately, down the oversized lapels of the grey coat hanging off her frame. A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. It was not a warm smile. It did not contain the recognition of a friend from the internet. It was the smile of an inquisitor who had just found the crack in the foundation of a house he had been hired to demolish. You look beautiful, Vesper, he said, and his voice in person had that same poetic violence she had felt through the telephone line. A rhythm that felt like an assault disguised as syntax. And you look like you hate yourself for it. The tempo of her blood surged, a sudden, frantic rhythm that made the quiet gallery feel small, the air thick with the smell of old wool and floor wax. Don't do that, she snapped, her tone sharpening into an edge she hadn't used since the morning before Luca died. Don't act like you can read the margins of my life just because we use the same vocabulary on a screen. You don't know why I wore this. I know exactly why you wore it, Calder said, stepping closer, breaking the polite distance required by the museum's architecture. He was tall, taller than she had expected, and he smelled faintly of black coffee, cold rain, and the sour tang of rolling tobacco. You wore the lipstick because you wanted to see if there was still a woman under the ghost, and you wore his coat because you wanted to make sure I knew you were bringing a third person to our lunch. Vesper's fingers balled into fists inside the deep pockets of Luca's coat. You're being cruel. No, Calder whispered, his eyes boring into hers with an aggression that felt beautiful and terrifying all at once. A heat that made her skin prickle beneath her silk shirt. I am being accurate. Accuracy is the only thing that doesn't smell like a hospital corridor. You didn't come here for comfort, Vesper. If you'd wanted comfort, you would have stayed on the floor with your laptop. You came because you wanted to see the man whose wife died with your husband. The words were too loud. A woman 2 cases down, looking at a miniature French salon, turned with a small, startled expression and hurried toward the exit. Sienna was 32, Calder murmured, his face inches from hers now, his voice dropping into that dark, rhythmic cadence that made her feel as though she were falling backward through ice into deep black water. She had a mole right under her left jaw that she used to hide with her hair when she was nervous. She liked soup she didn't know the name of. And your light bearer, your Luca, took her through a windshield at 45 miles an hour on a Tuesday evening. Vesper's hand came up, her fingers clawing at the air between them, not to strike his face, but to catch her own breath before it tore her throat open. He didn't choose the median, Calder. It was an accident. There were 3 cars. You know what the police report said. I know what everything says, Calder said, his tea-colored eyes narrowing into something tight and dangerous. But the report doesn't tell you how the metal sounds when it folds. It doesn't tell you that the air smells like antifreeze and hairspray for 20 minutes afterward. We are the survivors, Vesper. We are the vultures picking at the leather of their coats, trying to find a wallet or a reason to keep breathing. Tell me the truth. Are you wearing that coat to keep him alive? Or to make sure he can't get away from you? Come with me, Calder said. He turned abruptly, his oil-skin trench coat snapping against his calves as he moved toward the elevators, not waiting to see if her boots would follow him through the marble maze of the basement. He did not look back. He moved with the jerky, single-minded momentum of a man who had standard directions programmed into his marrow and could not change them without breaking. Vesper followed 3 paces behind. The guilt of looking beautiful for him had hardened now, freezing into a cold, heavy curiosity that tasted like copper in the back of her mouth. Her heart was beating at an erratic, elevated tempo that didn't belong in a museum. She did not want to leave him. She could not leave him. He was the only person in a city of 3 million people who didn't look at her with the soft, watery pity that made her want to scream. He looked at her like she was an accomplice, They moved out of the Art Institute's side exit and into the grey, slush-choked reality of South Michigan Avenue. The afternoon had completely dissolved. The sky was the color of a wet sidewalk, and the rain had turned into a heavy industrial mist that didn't fall so much as hang in the air, clinging to the stone facades and the black iron railings like grease. Calder walked fast. His stride was uneven. She noticed now that he had a slight, persistent hitch in his left hip, a small drag of the heel that left a different mark on the grey slush than his right foot. He was carrying an invisible fracture. He did not take her to a restaurant. He did not take her to an apartment with books and coffee mugs. He turned west on Harrison Street, leading her down into the concrete belly of a commercial parking garage. A brutalist monolith that rose 7 tiers into the grey air, smelling of damp oil, old road salt, and the stagnant, uncirculated cold of subterranean concrete. They ascended the pedestrian ramp to the 4th level. The wind of Lake Michigan whipped through the open concrete slats of the structure, whistling a low, metallic note that sounded like an old furnace kicking on. There were few cars on this level. It was a dead zone for commuters on a Saturday afternoon. In the furthest corner, beneath a flickering fluorescent tube that hummed with the high, angry vibration of a trapped wasp, sat a dark grey Volvo sedan. Vesper stopped. The breath went out of her in a small, white cloud that vanished immediately in the damp air. The car was a corpse. The windshield was a massive white spiderweb of safety glass that had caved inward on the passenger side. The tiny fractures glittering like salt under the fluorescent light. The front bumper was completely gone. The frame behind it crumpled into an accordion of rusted steel, and black plastic hoses that looked like exposed intestines. The hood had been torn away entirely, leaving the engine block open to the damp wind. A cold, iron heart that had stopped beating months ago. You told me you sat in the passenger seat, Vesper whispered, her voice catching on the sharp edge of the garage air. She approached the vehicle slowly, her boots dragging through the thin crust of salt on the concrete. Her hand reached out automatically, her fingers hovering just 2 inches from the jagged, broken edge of the passenger side window frame. On the forum, you said you keep sitting there because you couldn't drive anymore. You said you needed there to be somewhere that was hers. Calder stood by the driver's side door. He didn't look at the vehicle. He kept his eyes fixed on her mouth, on the fading terracotta of her lipstick. His expression completely flat, completely unreadable. I don't sit in the passenger seat to be near her, Vesper, he said. His voice had dropped into that low, gravelly register that felt less like speech and more like stone grinding against stone in the dark. I sit there because the driver's side belongs to the state of Illinois until the civil suits are settled, and because when I look through that glass, I don't see Sienna. He stepped around the front of the crumpled hood, his boots crunching loudly on the salt crust. The aggressive rhythm of his breath was the only living sound against the city's distant, muffled roar through the concrete slats. I see the headlights of a blue sedan coming across the yellow line, Calder murmured, his face inches from her shoulder now. He reached out, his hand surprisingly hot, almost burning, as his long fingers wrapped around the wrist of her grey wool coat, his grip tightening until she could feel the bone of her arm beneath the layers of fabric. He pulled her hand slowly, deliberately away from the broken window. I see a man named Luca Malone trying to swerve. I see him throwing his hands up over his eyes because he realized the light wasn't going to save him. Tell me, Vesper, when you look at me right now in this light, do you see a savior, or do you see the wreckage? Vesper did not pull her wrist away from his grip. The heat of his fingers was the only warm thing on the fourth floor of the garage. A direct physical current that seemed to drill through the heavy wool of Luca's sleeve and into her skin. She looked at him, at the broken bridge of his nose, at the cold, tea-colored eyes that were wide and dark, with an intensity that felt almost like an embrace. Her heart was thumping against her ribs like a bird in an attic. For 4 months, she had been told by everyone, by her mother, by her colleagues, by the grief counselor with the soft hands and the tissue box, that she was a victim of an act of God, a random alignment of steel and moisture, a tragedy without an author. And here was a man offering her an authorship. He was offering her a physical point of origin for the pain. She looked from his eyes down to the crumpled steering wheel on the driver's side of the Volvo. The airbag had deployed. It lay there like a deflated yellow bladder, stained with something dark and dry near the hub. And then her mind performed a small automatic maneuver. It was the maneuver of a book editor, the cold, administrative reflex that had spent 10 years looking at sentences and finding the word that didn't belong, the modifier that structural logic could not support, the tense shift that revealed the author was lying to himself. She had spent her week writing notes in the margins. The reader needs to feel his loss, not just observe it. She knew how narratives were constructed. She knew how people built prose to hide the things they couldn't bear to put in the main clause. She looked at the front of the Volvo again. The headlights of a blue sedan coming across the yellow line. That's what he had just said. I see a man named Malone trying to swerve. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Memory performing an uninvited excavation. She was back in her office in January, looking at the snow falling outside her window, holding a red pencil. She remembered the police report she had kept in her desk drawer for 3 weeks before burning it. The legal, dry description of the 3-car pileup on the interstate. Vehicle 1, Chevrolet, operated by driver intoxicated above legal limit. Crossed center line at mile marker 14.2. Vehicle 2, Volvo, struck by vehicle 1, causing secondary collision with vehicle 3, Ford. Luca had been driving the Ford. It was a silver Ford. It wasn't blue. And more than that, The police report had explicitly stated that the driver of the Volvo, the car that had been struck first by the drunk driver, had been taken to hospital with a fractured hip and a concussion. The passenger, Calder Mourne, had been pronounced dead at the scene. Vesper opened her eyes. The parking garage seemed to tilt slightly. The concrete beams overhead thickening. The hum of the fluorescent bulb rising to a scream that filled her ears. She looked at Calder's face, at the slight, tight twitch of his jaw, at the way his fingers were still holding her wrist with that desperate, burning pressure. He wasn't sitting in the passenger seat because he was traumatized. He wasn't tracking her down on the forum because he was a fellow survivor who chanced upon her post about a coat. He had known the color of Luca's car because he had seen it through his own windshield. But he had gotten the color wrong because the rain had been too thick, or because the liquor in his blood had turned the silver world into something blue before the impact. You said the other car, Vesper whispered, her voice dropping into a register that was completely devoid of poetry, completely flat. The voice she used when she was rejecting a manuscript that was too clever to be true. On the forum, Calder, you wrote, the other car, they said it was a woman who'd had too much to drink, crossed the median. Sienna never saw it coming. Calder didn't blink. His grip on her wrist didn't loosen, but she felt the muscle in his palm go rigid. A sudden, dead stillness that was more terrifying than any movement. Yes, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a thread of dry sound. That's what they said. No, Vesper said. her boots taking one slow step backward, dragging his hand with her. Her editor's eye was tracking the sequence now, the line-by-line verification of the lie. That's what you said, but Luca's car wasn't blue. It was silver. And the woman who was drunk, she didn't drive a Chevrolet. She was 32 years old, Calder. Her name was Sienna. The silence that followed was not the silence of the hospital corridor. It was the silence of the house immediately after the roof has collapsed. The brief, terrible pause before the dust begins to settle over the furniture. Calder's hand fell away from her wrist. He didn't try to catch her again. He stood by the rusted frame of the Volvo, his shoulders dropping, his arms hanging limp at his sides, as if the string that held his skeleton together had been cut by a pair of scissors. The hawk-like profile of his face looked old in the fluorescent light, the skin grey and porous, the color of road salt. "You're very good at your job, Vesper," he said, and the poetic cadence was entirely gone from his voice. It was just a small, broken sound, the sound of an old man talking to himself in a kitchen at 6 in the morning. "I always knew you would be. I just thought, I tell myself every night, that if I can make you love the language first, the truth wouldn't be able to kill the story." "You killed him," she said. The words didn't feel like hers. They felt like objects she was dropping onto the concrete floor between them, heavy and hard and metallic. "You were the driver." "I was the driver," Calder murmured. He turned his head away from her then, looking through the spiderweb safety glass of the passenger side, his fingers reaching out to touch the dent where his wife's head had met the pillar. Sienna was asleep. She'd had 3 glasses of wine at her sister's house, and she told me she didn't want to drive in the rain. She told me I looked sober enough. I thought I was. I thought I was the light bearer that night, Vesper. I thought I could see through the water. He turned back to look at her, and for the first time, she saw that his tea-colored eyes were completely wet. The water running down the hard ridges of his face without his permission, leaving dark tracks in the salt dust on his skin. I found you on the bridge, the forum, he whispered, his hands reaching out toward her, palms up, empty, like a beggar at a train station. I saw your post about the coat. I knew the name Malone because it was on every document the lawyers sent to my house. I told myself I owed you an echo. I told myself I could sit in the dark with you for long enough if I could give you the right words for the things that didn't have names. I could pay the debt. But the words didn't stay where I put them. Vesper stood in the wind, her fingers tucked deep inside the pockets of Luca's grey wool coat, her thumb pressing against one of the 17 grocery lists she had kept in the lining. Butter, coffee, salt, bread. The handwriting was small and blue and real. She looked at the man before her, the killer of her marriage, the architect of her loneliness, the only person who had ever made the machinery of her laughter work after the world had ended. She looked at her own Venetian earth lipstick on his collar, where she had stood too close. A tiny, reddish stain like a brand she had given him before she knew his name. The rain outside the parking garage was falling in the long silver curtains over Chicago, a language that dissolved before anyone could read it. "What do we do with the coat, Calder?" she asked, her voice very quiet, very poetic, very aggressive in its lack of mercy. "Do we burn it? Or do we keep it to remind us of what you did in the dark?" A sharp, brittle laugh cut through the drone of the fluorescent light, tasting of iron and cold grease. Vesper didn't retreat. Instead, she took a half step forward, the distance between them closing until the smell of his panic, sour, sharp, and metallic, overcame the damp musk of the concrete garage. "What's the matter, Calder?" she asked, her voice dripping with a casual, lacerating sarcasm that felt like a blade dragged across silk. "Should I take off the coat? Is that the sequence you had mapped out in your head? You spent 4 months editing my grief so you could get me into a corner, and now look at me. I'm wearing his wool, but under it, I'm dressed exactly the way you wanted. Do you want me to take it off? Do you want me undressed?" "No," Calder choked out, his hands dropping to his sides as if the skin of his palms had been scorched. He stepped back against the crumpled fender of the Volvo, his chest heaving under his oilskin trench. "No, Vesper. God damn it, that's not it. I don't want that. Then what do you want?" The question wasn't a demand for an answer. It was the opening movement of an execution. The poetic cadence returned to her throat, but it had lost its soft, midnight vulnerability. It had become a weapon. The aggressive, rhythmic pulse of a woman turning her skin inside out so he could look at the muscle. "Look at what you've built," she whispered, her gaze sweeping across the grey concrete, the salt crust, the dead car. "You didn't just cross a yellow line on an interstate, Calder. You crossed into my kitchen. You took the 6 o'clock morning light. You took the wrong mug, the one he was holding while we argued about where the poetry books belong. You took the kiss I kept inside my mouth because I thought there was a later. You turned my entire life into a museum and then had the audacity to buy a ticket to the exhibition." She stepped closer, her boots striking the concrete with the rapid, unyielding tempo of a hammer on stone. "You sat behind a screen and watched me bleed an alphanumeric code. You let me tell you about the 17 grocery lists. You let me believe that you were the only other person in this God-forsaken city who spoke the language of the dead, while you were the one who broke the syntax. You didn't just kill Luca. You killed the memory of him, because now every time I look at his coat, I have to see your headlights in the wool. I didn't mean to do it," Calder rasped. The words were blunt, unedited fragments, stripped of the philosophy he had used to shelter himself. He pressed his palms against his eyes, his shoulders shaking beneath the dark coat. "I can't live with it, Vesper. I swear to God, every morning I wake up and the air in the room feels like concrete in my lungs. I wish I wasn't here. I wish it had been me through that glass. I wish I didn't exist." "So do I," she said. The agreement was flat, absolute. It had no weight of malice behind it, only the terrifying gravity of a fact. Calder let his hands drop from his face. His eyes were bloodshot, the tea-colored irises swimming in a dark, wet glaze that made him look hollowed out, an empty shell held together by the salt on his skin. It's an execution every hour, he whispered, his voice cracking on the vowels as he pleaded with the space between them. I look at her things in the apartment, and I see his car. I look at the passenger seat, and I feel the glass hitting my face. I tried to find you because I thought if I could bear the weight of your dark, I could give you a place to put the words that didn't have names. It would mean something. It's a torture, Vesper. It's a literal, physical torture to know that the only thing I have left of my wife is the fact that I killed her. And the only thing I know about your husband is the shape of the hole I tore in your chest. Vesper looked at him for a long, unblinking, literal minute. Then, slowly, she lifted her right arm. She didn't use her hand. She took the heavy, frayed sleeve of Luca's grey wool coat, the fabric that had survived the rain, the winter, and the 5 months of her isolation, and raised it to her mouth. With a hard, grinding motion, she wiped the cuff across her lips. She rubbed until the Venetian earth terracotta pigment smeared across the coarse wool, staining the grey fibers with a dark, bruised streak of red. She rubbed until her lips burned, until the vanity she had constructed that morning was entirely erased, leaving her mouth pale and raw. She dropped her arm. The coat was defiled now. The narrative was broken. I hate it, she whispered, her voice catching on a dry, small sob that she choked before it could reach her eyes. I hate the fact that after everything you've done, after the wreckage and the lies and the blood on the interstate, you are still the only person in this world I can talk to. Before he could move, before he could retreat from the violence of her proximity, Vesper reached out. Her hand was cold, the fingers stiff from the garage wind, but she didn't hesitate. She drove her hand into the space between them and gripped his palm. Her fingers wrapped around his hot, trembling hand, holding it with a fierce, crushing pressure that felt less like an embrace and more like a constraint. She held him to the earth. She held him to the car. She looked up into his wet, tea-colored eyes, her pale lips trembling against the cold. You've written thousands of words to me, Calder, she whispered, the rhythm of her breath steadying into something lethal and tight. You've given me the physics, and you've given me the poetry, but you haven't yet told me that you're sorry.